In 1982, when I was 21, I joined a rock band that played together for 15 years. I played a guitar and sang lead vocals. My brother Quinn played bass, and our good friend Brad played the drums. As one would expect at the time, hard rock meant loud, very loud. As such, we were always trying to find a place to practice that we would not bother others. In the early summer of 1987, when I was 25, we decided that the best thing to do was to rent out a house where we could crank it up and not be a nuisance to the neighbors. I was, at the time, still living with my parents, and Brad was just coming to the end of his apartment's lease. We found a cheap house to rent that was maybe 50 years old, with its only drawback being that it had no AC. It was located in attractive homes that were all about 25 years newer, and for whatever reason, was set off by about 100 feet from the closest home in that area, and was surrounded by these huge eucalyptus trees. It was the perfect place for a rock band to practice. Brad and I and a friend of ours named Steve shortly moved in together. Just a note about the house. When you walked in, it was a very odd-looking place, mostly because of how the ceiling jutted out at odd angles in certain parts of the living room and the kitchen, and then joined together at even odder angles. It was just really weird. The windows were permanently shut, and because of the way the landlord had put up these permanent curtains, you couldn't see out, and no one could see in. The first night I slept there, I kept hearing these intermediate little scratching noises coming from inside the closet. I suppose it was probably mice, which was kind of creepy because I really hate rodents. I got some mouse traps the next day, but oddly, I never caught any mice the whole time we lived there. That first week, I had gotten home from work one afternoon and saw that Steve's car was already there. I went in and called out, "Hey Steve," but I got no answer. I walked through the living room and dining room area, and then through the kitchen back towards the bedrooms. There I saw Steve standing in the middle of the hallway, looking up at the ceiling. As I got closer, I could see that he was actually staring at the attic entry cover. I honestly don't even think that he was aware that I was even there. I asked him what he was doing. Without taking his stare off the attic cover, he said, "For some reason I feel like I want to go up in there." I jokingly said, "Yeah, have fun." I brushed past him and went to my room to get ready for practice. We finally got the band equipment and PA set up in the living room, and began practicing 4 to 5 days a week. It was unbelievably hot due to no air conditioning in this really old house, coupled with the blistering heat of the normal Sacramento summer. What is peculiar is that even though it must have been 100 degrees in the house when we practiced, a couple of our friends who would come to listen to us play both mentioned, independent of each other, that they felt cold air off in one corner where they sat. Other friends who would come listen to the band would remark how weird our house looked and how weird it felt. I never really gave it much thought, as I was super focused on getting the band in shape. On one particular Friday night, Brad was out on a date, and Steve and I were home alone. I was writing a new song, and it was coming together pretty fast. I was feeling really inspired, and when I finished writing the music, it had only taken me 20 minutes. My normal writing time for the music portion of the song generally took me an hour or two. I would always write the music fast, and then write the lyrics a day or two later, after I had taken the chance to ruminate on the music and see how it made me feel. Because I was feeling really encouraged that the music had come together so fast, I jumped right into making lyrics that night. Steve was watching TV on the other end of the room, and because I needed it to be a bit more quiet, I asked him if he wouldn't mind turning down the TV. He was kind enough to turn it off altogether. I started right in, and he just sat and listened. As I began coming up with lyrics to the song and blending them into the melody, Steve began to offer some lyrical suggestions. You have to understand, Steve was one of our biggest fans, and he made countless lyrical suggestions to me over the years. But his lyrics were always so goofy, and I just never had the heart to tell him why I never used any of his suggestions. However, on this night, It was the weirdest thing. As I was writing this new song, I would come up with a lyric, and then Steve would offer up a suggestion that would fit perfectly. This had never happened before, and it all happened so fast that we had written all the lyrics for this new song in less than 15 minutes, with perhaps 25% of the lyrical content coming from Steve. I could not believe it on a number of levels. The title I gave it was If I Had a Chance. The lyrics go as follows. Reflecting back in time, to the shadows of my mind, it doesn't seem that long ago, the reason nor the rhyme. Memories fade by the mist, just trying to exist. At times it's hard to know which way your life might go. If I had a chance again, if I'd only known back then, if I only had a chance, I would do it all again. At times it's best to think things through. At times your best will never do. 'Cause when you're young and so unsure, you can't tell evil from the pure. If I had a chance again, if I'd only known back then, if I only had a chance, I would do it all again. I would do it all again. Brad got home at around 1 a.m., and the minute he walked in the door, I told him, "Dude, you gotta hear this new song that I wrote while you were gone." He told me to give him a chance to change out of his date clothes, and he would be right out. I was sitting on a stool next to my amplifier when Brad came out. He pulled up another stool right next to mine, and said, "Okay, go for it." Steve was on the other end of the room watching TV again. The TV screen was the only light in the room. I reached over and turned on my amplifier, plugged in my guitar and strapped it over my shoulder. I formed an opening E minor chord on the fretboard, and when I went to pluck the low E string to start the song, the very second I touched the string with my pick, I heard an almost imperceptible voice coming from my amplifier. It whispered, "Don't touch me." It was so weird and so shocking that I kind of jerked my hand away from the fretboard. I looked at Brad to see what his reaction was. He looked at me in confusion and said, "What's wrong?" He obviously hadn't heard the voice. I told him, "My amp just said, 'Don't touch me.'" He laughed and replied, "Yeah, right." I was thinking in my head at that moment, maybe I just thought I heard it. Steve at the other end of the room was completely oblivious to what was happening. Anyway, I decided to go ahead and try to play the song again. I formed an E minor chord again. At the very instant I touched the low E string with my pick, the voice came again, a little louder and a little more forceful this time. "Don't touch me." Brad heard it this time, and he jumped off of his stool. Steve turned around and asked, "What's going on?" "His amplifier is talking," Brad shouted. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. I was just in shock, trying to process it all. All of this was happening within seconds. I was convinced that something really bad was going on. I just didn't know exactly what it was. Simultaneously, I thought to myself, I bet if I touch that string again with my pick, that voice will talk to me again. I was horrified at the thought, but I went ahead and did it anyway. This time, when I went to pluck the low E string with my pick, the pick got within a half-inch away from the string when the voice from my amplifier said in a gravelly tone, very loudly and very forcefully, "Don't touch me." I was appalled and amazed at the same time. Steve heard it this time and jumped off the couch with a terrified look on his face. At the same time, Brad ran back through the kitchen. Suddenly, I felt a very powerful and very malicious energy pressing down around me. I felt like there was a ton of bricks on my shoulders, and I couldn't move. I immediately felt like I was going to throw up. Brad came running back out of his room and shouted, "We need to say a prayer." Brad said a prayer out loud, but it changed nothing. I still felt this ominous and very dark presence trying to overwhelm me, and I was still nauseous. I was able to get my wits about me enough to run outside. Brad and Steve followed me. We stood there shocked and totally afraid. I told them that I wasn't going to go back into that house. After a few minutes of discussing what we would do, I decided to call my parents to see if we could come stay with them. All three of us went inside together, and I quickly called my parents. They asked me what was wrong, and I told them that I would explain later. The three of us drove to my parents and stayed at their house for the night. My parents told us the next day that there wasn't enough room for all three of us, and that Steve and Brad would have to find another place to stay. Steve and I went back the next day after work, while it was still light out, and got all of our stuff, and never went back. Steve moved back in with his parents, and I with mine. Brad's parents were in Oklahoma, and had no other family in Sacramento, so he had to stay at that house for another 3 weeks, by himself. He asked his girlfriend if he could stay at her parents' house for a week, until he found another place, but they said no. Brad later told me that he had nightmares almost every night while he was staying there. Just after he finally moved out, he called me one afternoon and told me about a dream that he had right before he moved out of that place. He said that in his dream, he was driving to American River College, where he was going to school at the time. He was going down a windy road beside a creek that was overgrown with a bunch of willow trees. He said it was really foggy, and he couldn't see where he was going at all. In his dream, he suddenly heard that same voice that came out of the amplifier that night.
"I know you, Tony."
I had no idea what that meant, but it scared me to death. The entire experience scarred me, and ultimately led me to the realization that there are evils in this world that we cannot see, but they can see us. Before we begin, I want to give you some context. I come from a small town in northern Wisconsin. I'm not going to say the name of the town, but the whole town is split in half between both Germans and Irish. The whole town is very proud of its roots, especially my family. My dad's side of the family is German, and a lot of our family traditions come from our German side. However, my mom's side is Irish, and my siblings and I were brought up with stories of Irish mythology. Most of these stories would come from our grandfather. Now, I can trace my mom's side of the family immigrating to the area during the 1850s, but my grandfather sounded like he was fresh off the boat. He would tell us traditional Irish fairy tales, from things like Fionn Mac Cumhaill, the ancient gods of Ireland, and other stories of Irish spirits such as leprechauns, and even banshees. As the years went by, I joined the Boy Scouts, and quickly jumped through the ranks, and eventually attended summer camps. As I became older, my troop decided to attend a new camp that was about 20 minutes from my house. I fell in love with the camp. The next year, me and my sister returned to the camp as staff members. Now, this was back in 2016. My sister and I continued to work in the camp in various positions. Now, this camp is pretty old. It was founded in the 1940s, right after the Second World War, and it still had this rustic look and feel, which made it feel welcoming during the day, but at night it felt a bit eerie. This obviously spawned a million ghost stories, all of which I dismissed, until that night. My grandfather had been diagnosed with cancer shortly before my sister and I left for camp. I was having a problem getting to sleep that night, so I went for a walk to clear my head. There was a full moon that night, so I could see clearly. Growing up in the North Woods, I was used to navigating a forest, so I wasn't concerned. Also, most animals, including the local bears, would just prefer to leave you alone. Because of the feeling of security I had, I would tend to get lost in my thoughts and lose track of time during my late-night walks. When I checked my phone, it said it was 11:21. Now I needed to get to bed, so that I could wake up at 6:30 and serve breakfast to the campers. I started walking back to the staff cabin, which was right above the boathouse on the lake at the time. As I walked down the path to the cabin, my legs instead brought me to the lakefront. I am still unsure as to how. I do not remember actively choosing to go to the lakefront. I was understandably confused, and I was about to turn around, when I saw someone in the water with their back turned to me. Every now and then, some kids would get the idea for a midnight swim, or two staff members during a summer camp romance decide to go skinny dipping. So I called out, "Hey there, you can't be swimming right now. It isn't safe." The individual in question did not respond to me, so I decided to walk down a little closer so I could talk to this person again. As I got closer, more and more features started to become apparent. I assumed that it was a woman because this individual had long dark hair and what I could only assume to be a green ankle-length dress. I could see that she was doing something in the water, although what exactly she was doing, I couldn't tell you. "Ma'am!" I yelled, trying to get her attention as I approached. At this point, I was maybe about 25 feet away from her. As I got near the entrance of the waterfront area, I yelled to her again, "Ma'am!" This time, I got her attention, and she stopped what she was doing. "You can't be down here right now," I started to say, as she slowly started to stand up. At this point, a shiver went up my spine, and I felt this instinct to flee, but I kept my feet planted. When she fully stood up, it dawned on me why I was so uneasy. She was not making a sound. When you go to a pool or a lake, or any body of water for that matter, and splash around, there's no way in hell that you're going to not make a sound. When I was hit with this realization, I noticed that she had started to turn around. I often hear people say that the second turned into minutes. Well, in this case, microseconds turned into hours. When she had fully turned around, I got a perfect look at her. She was pale. She practically glowed in the moonlight. I could tell that she was soaked, not just like she was splashing in the water. Instead, she looked as if she had climbed out of the shower. Although the thing that strikes me even to this day and keeps me awake at night were her eyes. While her entire body was perfectly proportional, her eyes were about as large as my fists, and they were jet black. Finally, my instincts took over, but instead of running off, I just fell back. That's when she opened her mouth beyond what was humanly possible and let out a scream that paralyzed me and felt as if it was going to annihilate my eardrums. After minutes of pure agony, she continued her scream. However, I forced myself up and sprinted roughly 100 feet to the cabin. I have no idea she followed me, and at the time I didn't care. I opened the cabin door and immediately slammed it shut. I locked it, and just in case, I moved one of the couches in the lounge to cover the door. The cabin's lounge was the hangout place for the staff, so half of the staff was sitting in the lounge. Everyone tried to ask me what was going on, but I couldn't tell them. Not that I didn't want to, I just couldn't produce the words to explain what had just happened to me. Needless to say, I couldn't get to sleep that night, and I didn't let anyone leave the cabin either. The next morning I saw my little sister. Usually she was always happy and cheery about something, but today was the exception. She appeared to be just as pale and tired looking as I was. We didn't say anything to each other. After the camp's morning flag ceremony, the camp director asked us to come into his office. He informed us that he had just gotten off the phone with our parents. He explained to us that our grandfather had passed away in the hospital the night before. I was shocked. Not only that I had lost a relative that I have always been close with, but the gears started to turn in my head, and I asked our camp director if he knew what time my grandfather passed away. He told me that he didn't know, and then followed it up by telling us that if we wanted to take a day or two off, he would understand. As me and my sister were leaving the campgrounds, I sent my dad a text message asking what time Grandpa had died. Both of us were extremely pale. I couldn't bring myself to say anything to her, so an uncomfortable silence lingered between us. A buzz from my phone came from my pocket. It was my dad's response to my previous message. It read, 11:21. Why? My heart skipped a beat. My sister and I have never talked about that night, although I'm certain that she also experienced something that night as well. At the time of this story, I was a 16-year-old high school student who had just gotten her license. I got a babysitting job for a couple who had a family wedding and needed a babysitter who would stay super late at night. I was referred to them by another family who I used to sit for. Keep in mind that this was when cell phones were just starting to come out, and I had this super crappy flip phone with a certain amount of minutes. There were 3 kids. The oldest was a boy about 8. There was another boy who was about 6, and a little girl who was just a toddler in diapers and couldn't speak. I came while the sun was still up to meet the kids, while the parents were still there. The parents were so cool. They showed me where all the snacks were and gave me some of the ground rules for the night. Kids in bed by 7:30, make sure they brushed their teeth. You know the drill. Once they left, we started off by eating dinner. To my shock, the middle child, who we'll call Teddy, kept throwing his fork super hard at his siblings and kept pinching his sister with his nails under the table. He also kept kicking my shins and throwing his food across the room. The moment his parents left, he became a nightmare. Their house was old but remodeled, so their toys were in the basement playroom. So after dinner, we all went into the basement to play. As soon as we went down the stairs, it felt wrong. Don't get me wrong, it was a nice-looking basement, with a couch and a flat screen. But there was just something creepy about it. The little girl kept pointing at a blank wall, one that had no pictures or anything on it, and kept screaming at the top of her lungs. It really unnerved me. At this point, I'm getting a really bad feeling. So I say, "Let's go upstairs and watch TV until bedtime." The kids seemed to like that idea, so I carried the little girl upstairs and turned on the TV for the 3 of them and go back down to grab her favorite stuffed dog. When I turned around to walk back upstairs, I see Teddy at the top of the stairs smiling down at me. There was something about his smile that really unnerved me. That's when I noticed that he had his hand on the light switch. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a phone or a light of any kind if this little shit locked me down in there. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, so if he closed that door, I was screwed. He flicked the lights off and goes to slam the door and lock me in the dark basement. I've never moved so fast in my life. I flew up the stairs and shoved my hand in the doorway to keep him from locking me down in there. I asked him why he did that and yelled at him to never do it again. All he did was smile at me, then slowly walked away, giggling. I put ice on my hand and watched him closely for the rest of the night. Bedtime came, and I put the kids to bed upstairs without any problems. There was 3 bedrooms. The parents' room was at the end of a long hallway, and the baby girl's room in the middle, and the boys shared a room with a bunk bed at the other end of the hall by the top of the stairs. Everything finally seemed quiet, and I began to forget about all the troubles I had from earlier. I settled down and started to watch TV. After about an hour, the baby girl started screaming again through the baby monitor, a scream that sounded like she was in pain. Thinking that her brother Teddy is bothering her, I ran up the stairs to stop him. As soon as I get to the top of the stairs, I see him laying down in his bed, facing the wall. The baby is hysterical, and again is pointing and crying. I am freaking out hardcore by this point. I cradle the baby until she falls asleep, and I check in on the boys, then return to the living room. What the hell is happening? Am I imagining things? I shake it off and turn the TV back on. This is when the night goes from bad to worse. Once back in the living room, I start to hear screaming every couple of minutes. What sounds like a grown man screaming in pain. It was coming from inside the house. I then heard footsteps. They sounded like little feet running upstairs in the hallway. For a second, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry that Teddy was out of his bed 2 hours after bedtime. So I go to the bottom of the stairs and call out Teddy's name and demand that he goes to bed. I didn't hear a response, but I did hear the footsteps continue. Then I heard what I think is him run into his parents' room at the other end of the hall, feet pounding down the hallway as clear as day. So I run upstairs thinking that I've caught him in the act. The hall was dark and empty. I turn and I find Teddy sitting up in his bed, staring at me again with that sickening smile. I could see his brother was still asleep on the top bunk. Teddy gave me the creeps. I tell him to lay down and go back to bed, and I head back downstairs. I then heard someone walking up from the basement, and I lose it. I slam and lock the basement door, and called my house number. My big brother answers, and I tell him that I'm scared. He puts me on speaker, and I explain everything to my family. I babysit almost every weekend, and I've never had a negative experience to where I had to call them like this, so luckily they believed me. My grandfather, who was a super religious man, prayed with me and calmed me down. My big brother got in his car and said that he would come sit with me until the parents got back. But the town I was in was a bit of a drive, so he told me that he would be there in 40 minutes. Even after we hung up, I could hear the footsteps running around the house. I myself am not a very religious person, but I sat on the couch and prayed through my tears. I've never been so scared in my life. I was absolutely terrified. The parents came home before my brother got there, and they saw that I had been crying. They asked me what happened, and I told them everything non-supernatural that happened, because I didn't want them to think that I was a crazy person and go around telling people not to hire me. I was going to play it safe and not mention it at all. So I just told them that Teddy was a handful, and that was it. As I was leaving, the dad said, in a dead serious voice, "Did the ghost bother you?" I slowly turned to him, not fully believing what I had just heard, and I asked him if he was being serious. He replied, "Oh, I'm being serious. We've had a ghost problem for a while now. Did you experience anything yourself?" I broke down and started crying, and then gave them an honest recap of the night. I told them about the screams I heard as clear as day, the footsteps, everything. About how the baby was crying at the wall, and how Teddy tried locking me in the basement. They believed every word. The parents said that they had moved in the house about 2 years ago, after the old man who built the house died inside of it. He was a hoarder, and fell and injured himself in the basement, and died among his piles of junk. And since no one could hear him scream, they didn't find him in time. By all accounts from the neighborhood, he was a mean recluse of a man. Either way, it was a terrible way to go. They said they would wake up every night to things flying off their kitchen counters and doors slamming. They would hear knocks and pounding in the walls. I was shocked. I asked why they stayed in the house if they knew it was haunted. They explained that they weren't able to move because of their jobs and current financial situation. I have to admit that although it wasn't huge, it was definitely a beautifully built home, the old construction kind of home, with bookshelves built in the walls and a winding grand staircase. The dad said that he would go downstairs every night for a year and say, "Go away. This is our home now. You aren't welcome here." He said eventually the activity stopped, and said that it only sparked up when someone new would stay in the house, or when they would have a babysitter over. They said, since I knew the truth, they would pay me extra to come back, since they could never keep a babysitter. Pfft, yeah, right. I'm never coming back here, I thought to myself. But I said that I would stay in touch, and I ran out of the house. I had to wait for my brother in their driveway, and he followed me home. I am ashamed to say that I never answered their calls again, but there was no way in hell that I would ever return there. I still babysat every once in a while, and I've never had an experience like that since. I still think of those kids sometimes, and I really think that Teddy was being affected somehow by the spirit in the house. I've never encountered a child so cruel, so negative. Thinking of his smile still sends chills down my back. I hope that they were able to move or clear the home of negative energy. Either way, that's one night I will never forget.
There's always a reason to be afraid.